In this movie, we take a look at our sandbox and start playing around with our float and clear options when it comes to our page layouts. Now, the first thing I want to do with the sandbox is I want to examine how this is laid out. Now, up at the top, we do have a heading, and then we have a playground to build and destroy CSS sandcastles, and then an unordered list. Then we have a few more little sections here talking about what the sandbox is and so on and so forth. And down at the very bottom, we have our related links. So here we essentially have our standard HTML flow. We can expect that one of our earlier elements will be this unordered list. So whenever we go and look at the actual HTML, we should find an unordered list towards the top of our HTML document. And indeed, we find it right here, because that's that standard document flow. So it's reading this from the top to the bottom and placing it as it goes. What our float-based designs are going to allow us to do is sidestep that so that we can indeed float one element out to the side of another. So let's go ahead and let's set up our first column here. So I'm going to set up a div with an ID attribute set to col1. So this is going to be my first column. Then I'll jump back into my style section here. And I'm going to go ahead and set up column 1. And I'm going to go ahead and set up the float and say float left. And I'll save and jump back in here and refresh. And we see that our list is now floating out to the left. And it's floating out to the left of where it originally was in our document. And thus, the rest of the content of our document is flowing around it. So what we have at this point is kind of like a column. Now, of course, we don't have a true column quite yet, but we do have the start of our two-column layout. It would just be a matter of setting up some other properties on this. Now, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and jump back in here and set up my width property. And if I set this to something like 15%, save that, and then refresh, I now have a nice liquid design. Because notice how, as I scale this down, our little content region over there to the left is also resizing. So in essence, that's our liquid design. So if I jump back in here and change it so that we are not floating out to the left, but floating to the right, then jump back into our sandbox and refresh, we see the list jump out to the right-hand side. Notice how it was still more or less in the same position that it began with. It just jumped over to the right-hand side. I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the sandbox here in the HTML, and I'm going to add in another rule here. So I'm going to add in a rule for column 2, and column 2 I'm going to float out to the left. And I'm going to set a width on it to 20%. And then I'll jump down and set up the div ID of column 2 or col2 to the next group of HTML tags. So I'll save that and then jump back in here and refresh. And now I see that I have a short history of CSS Sandbox floating out to the left. So here we have the essence of our 3-column layout. I'm going to go ahead and jump back in here and add in a third rule for this so that we can see how things stack. I'm going to go ahead and set up my column 3. I'm going to set the float to left. I'll set that width to 20%. And then Move on down into the body of the HTML and find the next logical group here. Type in the call 3. Jump down and close that div. Save it. And refresh my browser. And here we see our what is the purpose of the sandbox floating over to the left. Now because there was already an item floating there, it's stacking. So if I jump back into the HTML and go to my style section and add in the clear for left and save and refresh, what will happen is what is the purpose clears the left side and moves down below the float that was to the left. So it will float to the left, but only if it's the only item to the left. So here we actually see something that's really close to a 3-column layout. Now if I jump back into my CSS here and change my measurement systems, say I change this to 15M, and change that to M, and then change that to M, save and refresh, we're going to have a nice elastic layout. And then the last thing we'll do here is if we set up a containing element, we'll just call this container, that goes all the way around our content. And then set up a rule that's controlling the width of that container using an absolute measurement, we will have a fixed width design. So I'm going to go ahead and set the width here to 500px. I'll save that and refresh. And here I see we now have a fixed width, but we're also using some of our other measurement systems, so we actually have more or less this hybrid design at this point. One last thing that I'd do here for my container, just so you can see some of this coming together, set my margin to auto, and then refresh, and here we go, we have that centered look. Now that's a real quick look at our float property, our clear property, and using those properties in conjunction with our widths and measurement systems to create our float-based layouts in our sandbox.